How a doomed army kept winning defies explanation when examining American military situation throughout Revolutionary War, where Continental forces were consistently outnumbered by professional British soldiers, outgunned by superior artillery and naval support, starving due to inadequate supply systems that Congress could not fix, unpaid because Continental currency was worthless, and constantly on edge of collapse through desertion, expired enlistments, and defeats that should have ended resistance permanently. Yet somehow this desperate force achieved victories that contemporary observers considered impossible and that shifted war's trajectory toward American independence. The paradox becomes more puzzling when recognizing that American advantages were mostly theoretical. Fighting on home territory mattered less when British controlled major ports and could move forces by sea. Popular support wavered when British victories made independence seem unattainable, and motivation to continue fighting diminished as years passed without decisive success that might have justified continued sacrifices. 5 times between 1777 and 1781, American forces pulled off victories that defied logic by defeating British forces that should have crushed them easily. These weren't miracles in sense of divine intervention changing natural laws, but were moments when desperation became audacity, as American commanders and soldiers recognized that conventional tactics would guarantee defeat and that survival required taking risks that military professionals would have considered reckless. The victories shared common elements: improvisation replacing formal tactics, local knowledge exploiting terrain advantages, unorthodox approaches, confusing enemies expecting conventional warfare, and refusal to surrender despite circumstances that made continued resistance seem futile. Odds and common sense suggested Americans should have lost these engagements decisively, making their victories significant beyond immediate tactical results by demonstrating that revolution could survive despite British military superiority. Each impossible victory bought time for Continental Army to continue existing, encouraged wavering supporters to maintain resistance, and eventually convinced France that American independence was an achievable goal worth supporting, rather than doomed rebellion heading toward inevitable British victory. A ragtag army faces Europe's elite when Burgoyne's invasion force of over 7,000 professional soldiers, Hessian mercenaries, and Native American allies marches south from Canada in summer 1777, with objective of splitting New England from other colonies. By controlling Hudson River corridor, Burgoyne's unstoppable advance captures Fort Ticonderoga easily in July, demonstrating British military superiority and suggesting that American forces could not resist coordinated British offensive executed by competent commander with adequate resources and clear strategic objective that would isolate rebellious New England. The invasion rolls toward Albany through wilderness that British supply lines struggled to maintain, but Burgoyne's confidence was justified by a string of victories that drove American forces before his advance and that made British conquest of Upper Hudson seem inevitable within weeks. American militia opposing invasion was an untrained collection of farmers and local volunteers who lacked military discipline, adequate weapons, or experience fighting against professional soldiers executing coordinated maneuvers under fire. Disorganized American forces were commanded by officers with minimal military training, making them thoroughly outmatched against British and Hessian professionals who had spent years learning their craft and who fought in formations that maximized their advantages in discipline and firepower. The Americans had no business standing in way of British advance that was methodically reducing American positions and that seemed certain to reach Albany despite local resistance that could harass but not stop invasion force. The setup at Bennington involved British detachment under Lieutenant Colonel Baum sent to capture American supply depot and gather provisions for main army, creating opportunity for American forces to strike isolated British column rather than confronting entire invasion army. Baum commanded roughly 800 men, including Hessian dragoons, loyalist militia, and Native American scouts, professional force, that should have easily defeated whatever local militia Americans could assemble on short notice. The militia that broke an empire gathered from surrounding countryside when American commander John Stark received intelligence about British foraging expedition approaching Bennington, assembling over 2,000 volunteers who surrounded British position on August 16, 1777. Local farmers and volunteers who normally avoided pitched battles against professional soldiers recognized opportunity to attack isolated British force before reinforcements could arrive, understanding that their numerical superiority could overcome British advantages in training and discipline if they pressed attack aggressively from multiple directions simultaneously. They swarmed British detachment through coordinated assaults that prevented Baum from forming effective defensive line, overwhelming his position through weight of numbers and aggressive tactics that gave British no time to establish proper defensive formations or employ coordinated volley fire that was their primary tactical advantage. The annihilation was complete, as Baum was killed and virtually entire force was captured or killed, representing devastating loss for Burgoyne's invasion that eliminated over 800 experienced soldiers and destroyed supplies that British Army desperately needed. Bennington cripples Burgoyne by eliminating forces he could not replace and by demonstrating that American militia could defeat British regulars when circumstances favoured bold action over cautious defence. The victory turned tide of campaign by encouraging militia enlistments that swelled American forces while discouraging Native American allies who began abandoning Burgoyne's army after witnessing British defeat. The psychological impact exceeded tactical significance, as New England militia recognized they could win against professional soldiers. Leading directly to Saratoga, Bennington weakened Burgoyne's army at a moment when he was advancing deeper into hostile territory, where every loss was irreplaceable and where his supply lines were dangerously extended. France's entry into war resulted partly from Saratoga victory that Bennington made possible by reducing British strength and encouraging American resistance at critical moment when invasion seemed unstoppable and when collapse of Satie's aid. Northern resistance appeared imminent without dramatic reversal that Bennington provided. Outnumbered, surrounded, and starving described American situation at Saratoga in September and October 1777, when Gates and Arnold commanded forces that were divided between different positions, inadequately supplied by logistics system that was barely functioning, and facing British professionals who pushed relentlessly south toward Albany despite growing difficulties maintaining supply lines through hostile territory. By all logic, Americans should break under sustained pressure from professional army executing coordinated offensive operations designed to destroy American resistance through superior firepower and tactical discipline. Gates and Arnold's forces were numerically inferior initially, despite militia reinforcements arriving after Bennington encouraged enlistments, making their position precarious against British Army that possessed superior artillery, better equipment, and professional soldiers who could execute complex maneuvers under fire. Supplies were collapsing as American logistics struggled to feed and equip growing army, creating a situation where military success depended on defeating British quickly before American forces dissolved through starvation and desertion. British professionals pushed south with confidence born from victories that had driven Americans from strong positions, demonstrating that British could take whatever ground they chose through determined assaults that American militia could not withstand when British employed their full tactical repertoire. The logic suggested Americans should retreat or surrender, rather than accepting battle against force that seemed certain to defeat them through combination of professional skill and superior resources. The setup for Saratoga involved Burgoyne's weakened army advancing toward American defensive positions at Bemis Heights, where fortifications provided some advantage, but where ultimate outcome would depend on whether American troops would stand against British assault or would break and run, as militia had done in previous battles when facing determined British attacks. The stage was set for decisive engagement that would determine whether Burgoyne's invasion would succeed in splitting colonies or would end in unprecedented British defeat. The surrender that shocked the world occurred on October 17, 1777, when Burgoyne accepted that his army could not break through American positions and could not retreat successfully to Canada through hostile territory, where American forces would harass withdrawal and where his weakened army would probably be destroyed piecemeal. Arnold's reckless courage during battles of Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights drove British back despite being wounded and despite Gates's attempts to sideline him, demonstrating that aggressive leadership could inspire American troops to stand and fight rather than retreating when British pressure intensified. The militias' wild determination to continue fighting despite casualties and despite facing professional soldiers surprised British commanders who expected Americans to break after suffering initial losses in firefights, where British discipline should have given them decisive advantages. The combination of Arnold's tactical aggression and militia's unexpected resilience crushed British advance by preventing Burgoyne from achieving breakthrough that would have allowed him to reach Albany and complete his strategic objective of splitting colonies. Saratoga convinced France that Americans could win against British professional army in conventional battle rather than merely surviving through guerrilla tactics and strategic retreats that prolonged conflict without achieving decisive victories. French entry into war transformed strategic situation by giving Americans naval support, financial assistance, and diplomatic recognition that legitimized independence movement as viable alternative to British rule, rather than as doomed rebellion heading toward inevitable suppression. The war transforms overnight as France's commitment forces Britain to defend interests globally, rather than concentrating resources on suppressing American rebellion, creating opportunities for American success that isolated colonial resistance could never have achieved regardless of battlefield courage or strategic skill. Saratoga's significance exceeded its immediate military impact by changing international perception of American prospects and by convincing powerful ally that supporting American independence served French interests in weakening Britain, while advancing principles of national self-determination that revolution proclaimed. Two wooden forts versus British Navy seemed like mismatch that could only end in American defeat when British forces began assaulting Fort Mercer and Fort Mifflin in October 1777 after capturing Philadelphia and seeking to open Delaware River for naval supply of occupation forces. The British fleet controlled surrounding waters with overwhelming firepower that could reduce wooden fortifications to splinters through sustained bombardment, making American positions seemingly untenable once British committed adequate resources to eliminating obstacles blocking their supply line. Philadelphia is falling to British occupation, while forts stand alone as last American positions blocking British from using Delaware River for transporting supplies to army occupying captured capital, making their survival essential for complicating British logistics during period when Washington's army was retreating from city and seeking winter quarters. The forts were undermanned because most continental forces had withdrawn with Washington, leaving small garrisons to defend positions against British assaults that could concentrate overwhelming force against isolated strongpoints. Outgunned garrison at Fort Mifflin faced sustained bombardment from British warships and land batteries that pulverized wooden fortifications, while defenders struggled to return effective fire with inadequate artillery that could not match British naval guns in range or firepower. Battered by cannon fire that destroyed buildings and killed defenders, the fort seemed certain to fall within days once British began serious assault operations designed to eliminate resistance before winter weather complicated military operations. The setup demonstrated British military advantages in conventional siege warfare, where superior resources and professional expertise should have allowed them to reduce fortifications quickly through systematic approaches that American crescenti defenders could not counter effectively. The fort's survival seemed impossible once British committed naval forces, whose firepower exceeded anything Americans could employ defensively, making continued resistance appear futile gesture that would merely delay inevitable British victory without achieving strategic significance that justified casualties defenders would suffer. Holding long enough to save nation was fort's actual achievement despite their eventual fall to British assault, as weeks of resistance bought Washington time to extract his army from dangerous position near Philadelphia and march to Valley Forge, where Continental forces would survive winter while maintaining army's existence as organized military force. Against all odds, Americans hold Fort Mifflin until mid-November, when sustained bombardment finally made position untenable. and fought Mercer until late November, when British ground assault forced evacuation after garrison had inflicted heavy casualties on Hessian troops attempting earlier assault. Their impossible resistance delayed British supply operations during critical period when Washington's army was vulnerable to pursuit and when early establishment of secure British supply line might have allowed British to launch offensive operations against continental forces before they reached winter quarters. The weeks gained through Fort's defense were strategically significant, despite Fort's eventual loss, because time allowed Washington to position his army safely and because casualties inflicted on British during assaults exceeded losses Americans could afford, but demonstrated that determined defense could make British pay heavily for advances that should have been routine operations. Buying Washington time he needs to escape British pursuit and regroup his forces at Valley Forge preserved Continental Army through harsh winter when British controlled comfortable quarters in Philadelphia while Americans endured privation that would have destroyed less determined force. The Army's survival through Valley Forge winter resulted partly from time that Fort defenders bought by complicating British operations during autumn 1777, when British might have pressed pursuit more effectively if supply situation had been resolved quickly. Preserving army through harsh winter ahead was ultimate strategic victory that Fort defenders' sacrifice enabled, demonstrating that tactical defeats could serve strategic purposes when they bought time and inflicted costs that weakened enemies' capacity for sustained operations. The impossible resistance validated strategy of fighting defensive actions that delayed British without risking armies' destruction, proving that American forces could achieve strategic objectives through prolonged resistance, even when losing individual battles. The South collapses through series of catastrophic defeats, beginning with Charleston's fall in May 1780, when over 5,000 Continental soldiers surrendered in worst American defeat of entire war, followed by Gates's rout at Camden in August, that shattered remaining organized Continental resistance in region. The Continental Army was effectively destroyed in South by autumn 1780, leaving only scattered militia units and partisan bands to resist British occupation that seemed to have permanently subdued region and eliminated organized military opposition to royal authority. A loyalist commander named Patrick Ferguson marches through Carolina backcountry in September 1780, with mission to crush frontier resistance by destroying partisan bands and intimidating populations that might support continued rebellion against British authority that occupation forces were attempting to restore. Ferguson commanded over 1,000 loyalist militia, whose local knowledge and motivation to suppress rebellion made them effective counterinsurgency force against American partisans operating in region where conventional military operations were difficult. The Patriots have no army left to stop Ferguson's advance after Charleston and Camden eliminated Continental forces that might have provided organized resistance to British pacification campaign, leaving only local militia and frontier settlers to defend themselves without support from Continental Army that was occupied elsewhere and could not spare forces for Southern theatre, where British appeared to have achieved decisive victory. Ferguson's confidence was justified by British successes throughout South and by weakness of remaining American resistance that consisted of irregular forces without training, coordination, or supplies necessary for sustained operations against professional loyalist militia executing systematic campaign to eliminate partisan activity. The setup at Kings Mountain involved Ferguson occupying hilltop position with expectation that his defensive advantages and superior training would allow him to defeat whatever frontier militia Americans could assemble against the force that was veteran of previous successful operations. Backwoodsmen break British line when band of frontier hunters, farmers, and riflemen from Western Carolina and Virginia gather in response to Ferguson's threats against their settlements, assembling force of roughly 1,000 men who marched to intercept Ferguson's column before it could threaten their homes. These frontier fighters possessed skills in woodland combat and marksmanship that made them formidable opponents despite lacking formal military training or organization, their experience hunting in rough terrain giving them advantages in irregular warfare that conventional military forces could not match. They surround Ridge, where Ferguson had positioned his force on October 7, 1780, approaching through forest that concealed their movements until they were close enough to begin assault that Ferguson's defensive positions could not stop because attackers used trees and rocks for cover while advancing uphill. The storm of rifle fire from hidden positions overwhelmed Ferguson's defensive line as Americans refused to retreat despite taking casualties, pressing attack with determination, born from understanding that their settlement's survival depended on destroying this force before it could continue pacification campaign. They destroy Ferguson's entire force through sustained assault that killed Ferguson himself and forced survivors to surrender after suffering devastating casualties from American marksmen who picked off defenders systematically. Kings Mountain becomes turning point of Southern campaign by demonstrating that organized Loyalist forces could be defeated by frontier militia, encouraging continued resistance throughout region and forcing British to reconsider whether they could pacify backcountry through military operations that exposed their forces to destruction by irregular forces operating in terrain. New, intimately, is less than #0. 9 hash is greater than dot. Proof that revolution isn't dead came from unexpected quarter, as frontier settlers demonstrated capacity to organize effective resistance without Continental Army support, showing that American rebellion drew strength from local populations willing to fight when their immediate interests were threatened, even when larger strategic situation appeared hopeless. The victory energized Southern resistance at a moment when British occupation seemed permanent, and when continued fighting appeared futile, without organized military forces to coordinate and sustain resistance against professional British propacal and Loyalist troops. A broken army against Banastra Tarleton faced Daniel Morgan in January 1781, when most feared British cavalry commander in South pursued Morgan's force through Carolina backcountry with orders to destroy American detachment before it could unite with Greene's main army. Tarleton was legendary for aggressive tactics and ruthless pursuit of defeated enemies, making him dangerous opponent whose dragoons had crushed American forces repeatedly through shock charges that shattered defensive lines before Americans could establish effective resistance. Morgan's exhausted troops were a result of weeks of maneuvering through difficult terrain while being pursued by British forces, leaving soldiers depleted and demoralized by constant marching without adequate food or rest. The American force is outnumbered when counting only reliable Continental regulars, though militia reinforcements brought total numbers close to parity, with disadvantage that militia were notoriously unreliable in conventional battles, where British cavalry charges typically caused them to flee rather than standing to fight. Cornered at location called Cowpens on January 17, 1781, Morgan faced tactical dilemma of fighting with river at his back that prevented retreat, and with militia who would probably break when Tarleton's dragoons charged their positions. Burdened with militia known for breaking under pressure, Morgan needed tactical plan that would account for militia's limitations, while using them effectively to create opportunities for his Continental regulars to deliver decisive blow against Tarleton's advancing force. The setup required Morgan to either accept battle on unfavorable terms, where British cavalry advantages would be decisive, or attempt retreat that Tarleton's mounted troops would intercept and destroy piecemeal as Americans tried to escape. Morgan chose to fight using defensive position that channeled British attack, while positioning his troops in layers that would allow controlled withdrawal of militia after firing initial volleys, creating plan that seemed risky, but that was only option offering possibility of victory against superior British force. The fake retreat that stole victory began with Morgan's brilliant tactical plan, positioning militia in forward line, with orders to fire 2 volleys, then withdraw behind Continental regulars, turning militia's tendency to retreat under pressure into deliberate tactical maneuver that would draw Tarleton's forces into trap. Morgan uses double ambush by having militia retreat on cue, while Continentals held position to receive British charge, then launching cavalry counterattack from hidden position that struck British flank when they were pursuing what they believed was beaten enemy. A controlled retreat by militia executed as planned confused Tarleton into believing his assault had broken American line, causing him to order pursuit that left his forces disorganized and vulnerable. to continental counterattack supported by cavalry striking from unexpected direction. Perfectly timed volleys from Continental line at close range devastated British forces who were caught between American infantry fire and cavalry assault, creating crossfire that shattered British formation and turned aggressive British attack into disaster where hunters became hunted. They annihilate Tarleton's force through combination of superior tactical planning and disciplined execution that allowed inferior American force to defeat British regulars in conventional battle, capturing over 500 prisoners and killing or wounding hundreds more, while American casualties were minimal. Tarleton himself escaped with handful of cavalry after watching his command destroyed, his reputation for invincibility shattered by defeat that demonstrated British forces could be outmaneuvered and crushed when American commanders employed innovative tactics, exploiting British overconfidence. Cowpens shatters British momentum in Southern campaign by eliminating their most effective mobile force and demonstrating that aggressive British tactics could be countered by commanders who understood how to use terrain and troop dispositions creatively. The victory set stage for Yorktown by forcing Cornwallis to pursue Greene through Carolinas in ultimately futile campaign that exhausted British forces and drove them into Virginia, where they would be trapped by combined American and French forces in siege that ended British offensive operations permanently. The pattern emerges clearly when examining 5 victories' common elements: improvisation, replacing formal tactics, as American commanders recognized that conventional approaches would fail against British professional superiority, that success required creative, tactical solutions, exploiting specific circumstances. Local knowledge of terrain allowed Americans to position forces advantageously and to move through landscape more efficiently than British forces unfamiliar with region, creating opportunities for ambushes and surprise attacks that British could not anticipate or counter effectively once engaged. Unorthodox tactics confused enemies expecting conventional warfare, according to European military doctrine, making British commanders uncertain about how to respond when Americans did not fight according to established patterns that British training prepared them to counter. Refusal to die quietly characterized American resistance throughout war, as forces that should have surrendered continued fighting despite circumstances that made victory seem impossible, demonstrating determination that British could not break through military defeat alone. America didn't win by strength, but through unpredictability that forced British to adapt to tactical situations they had not anticipated and for which their training had not prepared them adequately. How impossible became inevitable resulted from American willingness to attempt operations that military professionals would have rejected as too risky, creating situations where boldness succeeded because British assumed Americans would behave cautiously and defensively rather than aggressively seizing opportunities that conventional wisdom suggested should be avoided. Breaking down common thread reveals that victories resulted from specific tactical innovations adapted to particular circumstances rather than from systematic approach that could be replicated mechanically, demonstrating that American success came from flexible, creative responses to challenges rather than from superior resources or training. The pattern was improvisation itself, finding ways to win with whatever forces and resources were available, rather than waiting for ideal conditions that would never arrive, given American disadvantages in conventional military capabilities. The victories that shouldn't have happened transformed Revolutionary War by demonstrating that American forces could defeat British professionals when circumstances favored bold action and when American commanders employed tactics, exploiting British weaknesses while avoiding British strengths. These impossible victories bought time for Continental Army to survive long enough that French intervention could tip strategic balance toward American independence that military situation alone could never have achieved without Allied support that Saratoga's victory made possible. The revolution succeeded because ordinary Americans kept doing what history said they couldn't, defeating professional armies despite inadequate training, surviving winters without adequate supplies, continuing resistance despite defeats that should have broken their will to fight. The message embedded in these victories was that determined resistance could overcome superior force when defenders possessed motivation that attackers could not match, and when defenders employed tactics that attackers could not counter, effectively through conventional military superiority alone. Impossible victories weren't miracles requiring divine intervention, but were results of human decisions to attempt operations that seemed unlikely to succeed, but that offered only chance for survival against enemies who would accept nothing less than complete submission. They were birth of strategy based on survival through any means necessary, adaptation to circumstances that conventional military doctrine did not address, and striking when enemies expected Americans to be too weak or too cautious to take offensive action that might expose them to counterattacks. Survive, adapt, and strike when no one expects it became American operational approach throughout war, as commanders recognized that playing by British rules guaranteed defeat, and that victory required rewriting rules to favor American advantages in motivation, local knowledge, and willingness to accept risks that professional military calculations would reject as imprudent. These 5 victories demonstrated that impossible was merely difficult when approached with creativity, determination, and willingness to sacrifice everything for independence that no alternative strategy could achieve against empire determined to suppress colonial rebellion through overwhelming military force. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a positive comment below. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming.